We got a full tank of gas, half a pack of cigarettes, it's dark, and we're wearing sunglasses. Hit it.
I got a bad feeling about this.
You see, we're on a mission from God.
Why, oh why didn't I take the blue pill?
Help me, Obi-Wan Kenobi. You're my only hope.
You want answers! I want the truth! You can't handle the truth!
Taking talk radio into a whole new dimension. This is the Don Johnson Show.
Hey everybody, welcome to another edition of the Don Johnson Show. My name is Don. Great to have you along with us today. As I speak, we are awaiting the verdict in the Kermit Gosnell murder trial that's taking place in Pennsylvania. Now, you may not have heard about the Kermit Gosnell trial that's taking place in Pennsylvania, but you should have. The media has been quite silent on this issue, and unless you peruse certain corners of the internet, this story may have passed you by. And it's unfortunate because it's a major story. It should be a front page story, as many have argued, including Connor Friedsdorf in The Atlantic. But it isn't a front page story, at least not in the mainstream media. And that's because this case shows the absurdity of our country's abortion laws very, very clearly. And so the media that are typically quite pro-abortion have been loath to cover it. But we are not loath to cover it here on the Don Johnson Show, and I didn't want it to pass by without some comment. Now, I thought about waiting for the verdict to come down before doing this show, but with my schedule, I'm not sure that's going to be possible, so I wanted to get the show in before my schedule got too busy here, and I was out of town. So here's the story. Kermit Gosnell is a 72-year-old abortion doctor, and I use doctor in the loosest sense of the term, because he certainly is not concerned about anyone's health. Mr. Gosnell is charged with murdering babies and women at his, quote, clinic in Philadelphia. Let me just read a little bit to you from the grand jury report, the indictment that began this case. Now, before we get to the grand jury report, let me warn you that some of what I'm about to say in this show is graphic and disgusting and evil. If you are around people that you don't want to hear that, or if you are a bit squeamish about that yourself, please be aware. It's not something I want to talk about, yet I think it needs to be talked about, so we're going to go ahead with it. This case is about a doctor who killed babies and endangered women. What we mean is that he regularly and illegally delivered live, viable babies in the third trimester of pregnancy, and then murdered these newborns by severing their spinal cords with scissors. The medical practice by which he carried out this business was a filthy fraud in which he overdosed his patients with dangerous drugs, spread venereal disease among them with infected instruments, perforated their wombs and bowels, and, on at least 2 occasions, caused their death. Now, this report in The Atlantic says, charged with 7 counts of first-degree murder, Gosnell is now standing trial in a Philadelphia courtroom. An NBC affiliate's coverage includes testimony as grisly as you'd expect. An unlicensed medical school graduate delivered graphic testimony about the chaos at a Philadelphia clinic where he helped perform late-term abortions, the channel reports. Stephen Masoff described how he snipped the spinal cords of babies, calling it, quote, literally a beheading. It is separating the brain from the body. He testified that at times, when women were given medicine to speed up their deliveries, it would rain fetuses and blood all over the place. One former employee described hearing a baby screaming after it was delivered during an abortion procedure. I can't describe it. It sounded like a little alien, she testified. Said the Philadelphia Inquirer in its coverage, prosecutors have cited the dozens of jars of severed baby feet as an example of Gosnell's idiosyncratic and illegal practice of providing abortions for cash to poor women pregnant longer than the 24-week cutoff for legal abortions in Pennsylvania. So that's one testimony. Now, the thing with Gosnell's clinic, you need to understand sort of up front, is that he seems to have specialized in making his abortion business as quick and easy as possible for him. And so what he would do is, rather than go through some of the usual procedures, is induce labor in women, give them painkillers and Pitocin, induce labor, have the baby come out, and then kill it, rather than kill it inside the womb. And indeed, Gosnell seems to be the kind of guy who took a lot of pleasure in this. We've already read about the unlicensed medical school graduate who seemed to have a fascination with abortion. Gosnell had a fascination with abortion. He seemed to love killing babies. In the Wall Street Journal, James Taranto talks about the history of abortions. And he tells the story of what is called the Mother's Day Massacre in Philadelphia. It was the brainchild of Harvey Carman, an eccentric California man without medical training who had served 2.5 years in prison for performing illegal abortions in the 50s. Carman teamed with a young Philadelphia doctor who offered to perform abortions on 15 impoverished women, each between 4 and 6 months pregnant, who were bused to the Philadelphia clinic from Chicago on Mother's Day in 1972. What the women didn't know was that they were guinea pigs for a device Carman had invented, which he called the, quote, supercoil. He had tested it only on wartime rape victims in Bangladesh, where he had traveled under the sponsorship of the International Planned Parenthood Federation. Complication rates were high, and little wonder. A colleague of Carman's Philadelphia collaborator described the contraption as, quote, basically plastic razors that were formed into a ball. They were coated into a gel so that they would remain closed. These would be inserted into the woman's uterus. After several hours of body temperature, the gel would melt, and these things would spring open, supposedly cutting up the fetus. As in Bangladesh, the Philadelphia experiment was a failure. 9 of the 15 women suffered serious complications. 1 needed a hysterectomy. The following year, the Supreme Court decided Roe v. Wade, and it would be 37 more years before the Philadelphia doctor who carried out the Mother's Day Massacre would go out of business. His name was Kermit Gosnell. So this guy's obviously got issues. These issues become even more apparent when you read some more of the testimony from the workers in his abortion factory. One was Karima Cross, who worked for Kermit Gosnell for 4 years, helping with abortion procedures. Cross testified that at least twice a day, 6 days a week, at least 2 babies would, quote, precipitate, or be birthed, before Gosnell ever arrived. She said Dr. Stephen Massoff, an unlicensed medical school graduate who we heard from earlier, with a ghoulish curiosity about abortion, would be there to snip the babies' necks. She saw him do it around 50 times. When babies were born in Gosnell's presence, he would do the dirty deed himself. Cross sometimes worked from 8 a.m. until 3 the next morning helping with procedures. She routinely saw babies born alive, moving, breathing, and moaning. Once in Gosnell's absence, Cross saw a large baby delivered into a toilet. She saw his little arms and legs moving in a swimming motion as he struggled to get out of the toilet bowl. Cross held her hands 12 to 16 inches apart to demonstrate to the jury how big the baby was. Adrian Moten, who was the first worker to testify for the prosecution, snipped the baby's neck in front of the mother while she sat bleeding into the toilet. Moten then took the body away and put it in a container. In 2009, Cross testified that another co-worker, Linda Williams, called Cross over to see a baby that had just been born. Cross saw the baby's chest heaving up and down in steady breathing motions. Linda reached down and lifted the baby's hand up, but the newborn pulled it away on its own strength. Cross said she saw the baby breathing for about 20 minutes before Williams murdered the child by severing its spinal cord with scissors. Cross demonstrated again with her hands that the baby was about 1 foot long. Cross's testimonies continued, and she showed some pictures. One photo taken by Cross showed 2 shelves located above the same sink where Liz Hampton washed aborted baby remains down a drain to be ground up in the garbage disposal. Crammed and stacked onto the shelves were about 50 jars containing severed fetal feet floating in liquid. Another photo showed a harrowing close-up of Gosnell's grisly collection. The report goes on. One patient was particularly memorable to Cross. Her name was Shaquana Abrams. Cross knew she worked with a friend, and after Abrams' abortion, the two kept in touch. Abram was far advanced into her pregnancy when she came to Gosnell for a 2-day procedure. No one was ever told why she decided to end the life of her baby. Abrams had been heavily sedated. As she lay sleeping on that filthy, torn table in the Monet room, the biggest baby Cross had ever seen in her years with Gosnell, quote, just came out. Cross again indicated with her hands that the baby was 12 to 18 inches long. Gosnell picked up the little boy and placed him in a plastic shoebox. The baby was so big he didn't actually fit. His arms and legs were splayed out and draping over the edges of the box. Suddenly, on his own accord, the baby drew in his arms and legs to fit himself in the box. In a different report, this episode, we read that Gosnell said, "This guy's so big he could walk me to the bus stop." Gosnell then took the box over near the antiquated ultrasound machine and snipped the baby's neck, but never suctioned the cranial contents as they sometimes did after babies had completely entered the room. The courtroom designation was Baby Boy A. The horrific photo taken by Cross seemed to overwhelm the courtroom. His corpse was supposed to be taken to the freezer that night, but when Jimmy Johnson came into the next morning to take out the trash, which included removing the abortion remains from the procedure rooms, he found the large, dark-haired baby still lying in that box in the Monet room where it had been left. Jimmy complained about the gruesome discovery and then took the baby to the basement with the rest of the human remains. So these kind of reports go on and on. Hundreds and hundreds of babies were killed in this manner at the Gosnell abortion mill. All right, so what's been the response to this? Well, on one hand, most in the abortion industry and the media elite that support them have remained silent. I think they realize that this case exposes the absurdity of the abortion laws in this country and many of the arguments supporting abortion, which we will get to in a minute. And so rather than even step into the ring and try to make sense of this issue, they've remained silent because they don't really have much to say. Now, there are those that have stepped in from the pro-abortion side and tried to distance themselves from Gosnell. I mean, it's pretty hard for somebody to come out and support this. At least it should be. So what they've said is, okay, we're pro-abortion. We still very much support the laws and the practice of abortion in this country. But what Gosnell did was not abortion, so it doesn't really apply. Okay? Hey, we hate Gosnell too. But he's not doing abortions. So it doesn't really affect our position at all. We support abortion, but Gosnell wasn't doing an abortion. Therefore, we separate ourselves from him that way. You see, abortion is inside the womb. What Gosnell was doing is outside the womb. Two completely different things, right? Let me give you an example. This is from Dr. Tracy Weitz of the University of California, San Francisco, talking about the difference between late-term abortion, which she supports, and what Gosnell did. Well, when a procedure that usually involves the collapsing of the skull is done, it's usually done when the fetus is still in the uterus, not when the fetus has been delivered. So in terms of thinking about the difference between the way abortion providers who do later abortions in the United States practice and this particular practice, well, they are completely worlds apart, she says. As Mark Stein noted, technically they're only inches apart, actually. So her argument, Dr. Tracy Weitz's argument, boils down to, oh, well, that's not abortion. Indeed, this theory runs through a lot of commentary from the pro-abortion side. Way back in 2011, for example, when William Silleton used the Gosnell case as a vehicle to discuss late-term abortion generally, a writer at Feministing argued that doing so was inappropriate because, quote, if this doctor delivered these infants, live infants that were breathing, and then killed them, well, let's make something clear. That is not abortion. Okay? So the argument there, again, is, oh, no, abortion is inside the womb, and that's the topic that we talk about and support. But what he did was outside the womb, and therefore that is murder. And indeed, that does seem to be what our laws indicate, that abortion happens inside the womb, but if he lets that baby get out and then kills it, that's murder. That's why Gosnell is up on charges, right? But there's obviously some issues here, right? It leads to the question, what exactly is the essential difference between infanticide and abortion? What is the difference between the baby that you're not allowed to murder and the, quote, fetus that you can destroy other than its location? If it's just the location, inside the womb, and then 15 seconds later it's outside the womb. 15 seconds earlier it's inside the womb, go ahead and do what you will with it. 15 seconds later outside the womb, no. Now you have to try to keep it living. Not only not kill it, but try to keep it living. Here's the thing, and this is why I bring this up. I mean, I'm not sure. Do people not know what happens in an abortion? The only difference between what Gosnell did and what thousands of abortionists do every day is that he killed the baby outside of the womb rather than in it. It's not that technically he did anything different. I mean, you want to talk about cutting a baby's spine with scissors? That is exactly what abortionists do in late-term abortions. They deliver the baby halfway and then snip its neck. I'm going to describe it actually here in a minute using the language from a court case. And then bring it the rest of the way out. That's perfectly legal in many states. In fact, that is what President Obama has continually supported. He has voted against laws that would stop that practice. Delivering the baby partway out, snipping its neck, and then bringing it the rest of the way out is considered it used to be considered a partial birth abortion. Now it's a late-term abortion because, as we'll see again in a few minutes, the terminology, in order to support what's actually happening here, the pro-abortion side has to obfuscate and get very vague and confusing with their language. I mean, again, think of what do you think happens if you support abortion, but you don't support killing the baby after it has been delivered? What do you think happens in an abortion? I mean, does the baby just appear magically at the very end of the birth canal fully formed, but before that, it's just a blob of tissue? Does it suddenly grow hands and feet and eyes and lungs and a brain and an ability to make noise, and before it was just some sort of clump of cells? I mean, how do you think abortionists get rid of the, quote, fetus inside the womb? Do they vaporize it? Just make it disappear completely? No. They dismember it using the same tools that Gosnell would have used to kill the baby after it came out. They dismember it, kill it, expel it out of the mother, and then if it has come apart too much, they have to try to piece it back together on the table, put the arms, is there 2 arms, is there 2 legs, is the head there, so that they know they have all the parts, and then they throw that baby in the trash. I mean, is the problem that people have with Gosnell that he kept the feet on the shelf? Admittedly, sick and disgusting and evil. But would it have been better if he had just put them in the trash like all the rest of the regular abortionists do and get rid of them that way? A lot of people shy away from thinking about or talking about what exactly happens in abortion, but I think it is important that we understand. So let me read to you from the Supreme Court's opinion in Gonzalez versus Carhart, which was another case about choice. Leroy Carhart was an abortion quote, physician, and in the high court he joined his friends at Planned Parenthood in the city of San Francisco to defend partial birth abortion. Okay, as I've said, since later we've rebranded it late-term abortion. And the 5 justices described varying abortion procedures with clinical precision in their judgment. And so let me read a little bit of this. So most common is the first trimester, quote, suction curettage, in which the abortion doctor vacuums the unwanted embryonic tissue from the womb. That's the language they used. By the time the second trimester is reached, this tissue has matured into the unmistakable shape of a child. Thus, the dilation and evacuation procedure is often called for. Employed millions of times in this most civilized country, as reported by Andrew McCarthy in National Review. D&E, the court explained, involves the physician's use of forceps to tear apart the fetus by ripping it from the cervix and then evacuating the fetus piece by piece until it has been completely removed from the mother. Often, the justices observed, the D&E doctor finds it more congenial to kill the fetus a day or 2 before performing the surgical evacuation, since medical experience has shown that once dead, the fetus's body will soften, becoming easier to dice and remove. Oh, and another helpful tip, rotating the fetus as it is being pulled decreases the odds of dismemberment. Now, those were all legal by the time Carhart was decided. Roe versus Wade had been on the books for over a generation by that time. And D&E enjoyed the stamp of judicial approval. The only question before the Carhart court was whether partial birth abortion, intact D&E, they called it, was beyond the pale. This medical procedure is triggered by an advanced stage of maturation in which the child's well-developed head tends to lodge in the cervix. So, the baby's head is too big by this time to do a D&E. Relying on the instruction of Martin Haskell, another experienced abortionist, here's what the justices related. This is how you do the partial birth abortion. The right-handed surgeon slides the fingers of the left hand along the back of the baby and hooks the shoulders. They use the term fetus. I'm going to use the term baby because I'm tired of using that silly term. The shoulders of the baby with the index and ring fingers palm down. While maintaining this tension, lifting the cervix and applying traction to the shoulders with the fingers of the left hand, the surgeon takes a pair of blunt, curved Metzenbaum scissors in the right hand. He carefully advances the tip, curved down, along the spine and under the middle finger until he feels it contact the base of the skull under the tip of his middle finger. The surgeon then forces the scissors into the base of the skull. He spreads the scissors to enlarge the opening. The surgeon then removes the scissors and introduces a suction catheter into this hole and evacuates the skull contents. With the catheter still in place, he applies traction to the fetus, removing it completely from the patient. So, as McCarthy points out, evacuates the skull contents may be more bracing than snip, but it doesn't quite do justice to the process and the frightful insocuence behind it. That was left to a nurse who had watched Haskell perform the procedure on a 6-month-old. She recalled that once all but the head had been delivered. Here's what she said. The baby's little fingers were clasping and unclasping, and his little feet were kicking. Then the doctor stuck the scissors in the back of his head, and the baby's arms jerked out, like a startle reaction, like a flinch, like a baby does when he thinks he's going to fall. The doctor opened up the scissors, stuck a high-powered suction tube into the opening, and sucked the baby's brains out. Now the baby went completely limp. He cut the umbilical cord and delivered the placenta. He threw the baby in a pan along with the placenta and the instruments he had just used. And this is the procedure that President Obama has consistently supported. So my question is, what exactly is the difference between that and what Kermit Gosnell and his band of barbarians did at his abortion mill? The only difference is a couple of inches. Gosnell let the baby come completely out before doing exactly that procedure. It's legal in many places to do that as long as you leave the baby partially in. Tell me if that's logical. Tell me if that makes a lot of sense to anybody. The bottom line here is that Gosnell's on trial because he did things 30 seconds too late. John Jelcevek points out that there's a grotesque subversion of logic that lies at the heart of legalized abortion. Gosnell, after all, faces the death penalty for allegedly killing newborns that, in many states, it would have been perfectly legal for him to kill a few minutes earlier. In fact, if he had killed the babies a few minutes earlier, the law in many states would have defended Gosnell's actions as constitutionally protected health care. The abortionist crime isn't therefore the fact that he killed these babies, but that he was too unskilled to kill them in the right way. Kill the baby one instant, and it's reproductive health care. Kill the baby the next instant, and it's capital murder. This is the outrageous contradiction created by legalized abortion. That's exactly right. Doug Wilson has a good article on this. He hopes that the Gosnell trial will be sort of a Gulag archipelago for our generation, in the same way that Alexander Solzhenitsyn published the horrors of what the Soviets were doing and awakened a generation to true evil. Wilson hopes that maybe some people will be awakened to the evil that is abortion. I am hopeful as well. I'm not confident that that's the case. But, as Wilson points out, certainly it should wake people up. Wilson points out that Gosnell's trial reveals just how arbitrary and how demented our entire national policy on the subject of abortion has been. Think about it, he says. First, let's talk about the arbitrary nature of what we allow and what we don't. Partial birth abortions, which Obama does not want restricted, do exactly what Gosnell was doing, only with the baby half in and half out. This makes a major ethical difference, apparently. Regular abortions do these things with the baby all the way in. Gosnell does these things with the baby all the way out. And he's the freak show? If he put the baby back inside the mother in a reverse cesarean and cut the spinal cord then, he is a responsible medical professional again? If it happens here in the middle of the room, it is a protected constitutional right. If he carries the baby over to the corner where the light is better, then he can be charged with murder. And he's the freak show? What about the lawyers and lobbyists that insist on this? What can be said on behalf of a nation that is even a little bit okay with this? It's like having laws that say you can shoot your mom in the kitchen, but not in the living room, and then demanding that everybody continue to respect the majesty of the law. But demented is as demented does. When the court upheld Roe, their argument was that they did not want to undermine respect for the judicial system by overturning a terrible law. Right, there's nothing like doubling down on lunacy to help persuade everybody that everything is just fine. It's as though some horrible event happened in Canada that caused a stream of refugees to head to our border, and someone with a precise legal reasoning skills developed the schizophrenic policy of shooting the refugees on their side of the border, but demanding the ultimate in medical care for them if they managed to make it across the border alive. You can learn a lot of amazing things in Harvard grad class. Gosnell's problem is not with what he was doing, which countless progressives have defended with their special kind of passionate malice, but with where he was doing it. You see, he was doing it where people could see. I think Wilson's exactly right on that. Our abortion policy is clearly absurd. And if we have eyes to see it, the logic of abortion is clearly absurd. And perhaps Doug Wilson is getting at least part of his wish in that it does seem that the Gosnell trial has awakened some people to think more clearly about their pro-abortion position. In the Wall Street Journal, James Taranto cites PJmedia.com's Roger L. Simon as one example of a person who has changed his thinking a little bit. As the trial of Dr. Gosnell is a potential time bomb exploding in the conventional liberal narrative on abortion itself. I can give you 2 guinea pigs to prove this point. My wife Cheryl and me. We were in the kitchen last night preparing dinner when we saw a short report on this story on the countertop TV. Both lifelong pro-choice people, after watching only seconds, we embarked in an immediate discussion of whether it was time to reconsider that view. Didn't human life really begin at the moment of conception? What other time? Neither of us was as comfortable as a pro-choice advocate in the face of these horrifying revelations. How could we be? Now, Simon hasn't become a completely pro-life person, but he's thinking about it. As is James Taranto himself. He's become much more pro-life over the years. Actually, as I've read Taranto, he's become much more pro-life. And one of the reasons is he's noticed that, when you think about it, it's not quite as logically sound as maybe I thought it was. He points out that when you dissent from Roe versus Wade, you notice that people committed to the pro-abortion side almost never acknowledge that the question of abortion poses a conflict of rights or of legitimate interest. So they don't admit, for instance, that there is a baby that has rights too. It's always just about the mother. There's no other being in the equation at all. Try to pin them down as to where they draw the line. At what point in fetal development does abortion become unacceptable? It's pretty much impossible. The court in Casey said abortion could be restricted after 23 to 24 weeks, earlier than Roe's 28, but groups like Planned Parenthood oppose restrictions on late-term abortion too. All they care about is a woman's right to choose. This line-drawing exercise is indeed a vexing one. We aren't pro-life. That's Taranto talking about, which is to say that we do not favor the outlawing of all abortion, and not only because of the difficult cases that are often noted. Our own moral intuition is that an early-term abortion or the use of an abortifacient to prevent implantation is different in kind from a late-term abortion or infanticide. But here's the key thing. But we concede that intuition is irreconcilable with the scientific fact that the difference between a zygote and an infant, or for that matter an adult, is one of degree. All are the same human being at different stages in development. Any line one could draw between acceptable abortion and homicide would be an arbitrary one. That's exactly right. Any line you draw where you say on one hand, this is murder and it's not acceptable, but on the other hand, this is not murder and it is acceptable, is completely arbitrary. At what stage in the development does it go from becoming a, quote, fetus that you can kill to a baby that you can't? That's the problem. Even some abortion doctors run into this problem. Ross Douthat, New York Times columnist, quotes Lisa Harris, who's a Michigan doctor, who wrote an essay for Reproductive Health Matters, trying to come to terms with the goriness of second trimester abortions. And her essay describes performing an abortion on a woman who was 23 weeks along, and then immediately running to deliver a premature baby of 23 weeks. I thought to myself how bizarre it was that I could have legally dismembered this fetus now newborn if it were inside the mother's uterus, she writes, but that the same kind of violence against it now would be illegal and unspeakable. Later she notes, currently the violence and frankly the gruesomeness of abortion is owned only by those who would like to see abortion disappear. Well, I think there's a good reason that it's owned by them and not by the other side. They don't want to admit the truth. They don't want to face up to the truth. Does it make sense that you should be able to kill the 23-week-old, dismember it, as she rightly said, and then rush over to a 23-week-old baby that was just born and take care of it? And that if you tried to kill that baby now, you'd be up for murder. Does that make any sense to anyone? It shouldn't. Now, this absurdity is why abortion advocates have to lie and obfuscate, I think. They have to speak about these issues in language that is not clear. That's what that doctor was just talking about. The gruesomeness, the reality of the situation is not owned by the pro-abortion side. They're not facing up to reality. They're not using clear and plain language. They have to use euphemisms and vague language to support what's going on. Mark Stein has a good post about this in National Review. It's called Baby Talk. And he says that even those who try to speak about this in a more realistic way can't bring themselves to use the language. For example, Howard Kurtz on CNN. He says, Kermit Gosnell is on trial for allegedly running a house of horrors, storing all kinds of mutilated fetuses, some of which were brutally killed. But they weren't fetuses. That's not what he wasn't on trial for killing fetuses or mutilating fetuses. Gosnell is on trial for killing babies. As I read in the grand jury report earlier, it says this case is about a doctor who killed babies and endangered women. He regularly and illegally delivered live, viable babies and then murdered these newborns by severing their spinal cords with scissors. That's what he's on trial for. not for murdering fetuses. And that's not a minor point. Even Ross Douthat, in that column that I mentioned earlier, at one point, and maybe this was the New York Times editors placing this in, I don't know, I'm a fan of Douthat, but at one point, he talks about paying attention to the grisly case of a Philadelphia doctor whose methods of late-term abortion included snipping the spines of neonates after they were delivered. Neonates? You know, who talks about their baby as a neonate? No, he snipped the spines of babies. Let's talk about it plainly. Indeed, media outlets have been having a heck of a time trying to talk about the story, those that have got around to it. For instance, they've called the baby outside, consistently called it a fetus, like we just said, or a viable fetus. In March, the Associated Press got into a bit of trouble for saying that abortions are typically performed in utero, as if Gosnell's on trial for performing abortions outside of the womb. No, again, he's on trial for murder, right? Yet they're trying to make sense of this and fit it into their language scheme, and, well, what's going on here? He's clearly doing the same thing as an abortion, but he's doing it outside of the womb, so can we call that a post-birth abortion? Oh, wait, yes, we can call it a post-birth abortion. In fact, that's what, as we'll see in a minute, an article in a prestigious medical journal argued for just that. But what have we called that in the past? Infanticide. That's killing babies. Now we'll call it post-birth abortion. Okay. The fact is that abortion is about killing a baby. That's what it's about. This is why abortionists will generally not help a baby squirming for life after it has been born. Even if they don't actually kill it, like Gosnell did. The evidence is mounting that many, many of them will not treat that baby. Just this week, we had a pro-life group release an undercover video showing a late-term abortion doctor agreeing not to help a baby live if he or she survived the abortion. This is produced by a group called Live Action. A woman who's 24 weeks pregnant tells a Washington, D.C. abortionist that she wants an abortion. The woman asks, "Has a baby ever survived?" Usually at this point in your pregnancy, it's too early to survive. Usually. It will expire shortly after birth. It's all in how vigorously you do things to help the fetus survive at this point, the abortionist says. Later, the woman asked, "Does it ever, move or anything when it comes out?" "Well, that's why I try to sever the umbilical cord first, and we wait for that to stop pulsing. And this way the fetus is expired first, so it doesn't move," the doctor said, explaining the technique done inside a woman to help deliver a dead baby. "Well, has it ever survived?" she asked. "Not here. No," he says. "But if it did survive, what would happen? Would I have to take it home or be responsible?" the woman asked. At first, according to the video, Santangelo answered that he's legally required to help the infant. Technically, legally, he would be obligated to help it survive, but it probably wouldn't. It's all in how vigorously you do things to help a fetus survive at this point. If everything possible is done, maybe there's a 20 to 30% chance it would live, he said. If you don't do anything, then the chances are much less. I'm just scared of having to be stuck with the responsibility. But you would make sure that it doesn't survive. We would not help it, the doctor said. We wouldn't intubate, let's say. To intubate is to help the baby breathe. "So you would make sure it didn't survive?" the woman asked. "Yeah, we wouldn't do anything extra," he says. And this is quite common. There's more and more of these videos coming out. Indeed, at a recent committee hearing in the Florida legislature, Elisa Lapolt Snow, who's a lobbyist for Florida Alliance of Planned Parenthood affiliates, was interacting with members of the Florida House. And Representative Jim Boyd asked, "If a baby is born on a table as a result of a botched abortion, what would Planned Parenthood want to have happen to that child that is struggling for life?" The lobbyist Snow replies, "We believe that any decision that's made should be left up to the woman, her family, and the physician." Representative Daniel Davis then asked Snow, "What happens in a situation where a baby is alive, breathing on a table, moving? What would your physicians do at that point?" "I do not have that information," Snow replied. "I'm not a physician, I'm not an abortion provider, so I do not have that information." Representative Jose Oliva followed up, asking the Planned Parenthood official, "You stated that a baby born alive on a table as a result of a botched abortion, that the decision should be left to the doctor and the family. Is that what you're saying?" Again, Snow replied, "That decision should be between the patient and the health care provider." Now, a week later, Planned Parenthood had to come out with a statement saying that they are not in favor of killing babies who survive a botched abortion, but that doesn't reassure me, let's say. I mean, the president himself, back in 2001 when he was a member of the Illinois Senate, fought against the Born Alive Protection Act again and again, has fought against it. Now, that Journal of Medical Ethics that I mentioned, last year published a paper by 2 academics who argued that what we call after-birth abortion, killing a newborn, should be permissible in all cases where abortion is allowed, including cases where the newborn is not disabled. And as Taranto points out, that's the brutal logic of the abortion position. I've said often on the show that logic is a hard taskmaster, and the logic of abortion leads to infanticide, clearly. If you're able to kill that baby in the womb, you can kill it outside the womb. That leaves you then, basically, with 2 options. Either support the killing of babies, or don't. On one hand, as one pro-lifer wrote, on one hand he thinks, you know what? We should acquit Gosnell. He's only doing what all the other abortion doctors do anyway, and if abortion is legal, let's just acquit him and make it very clear where we stand as a culture in regards to how we value our infants. On the other hand, I would suggest maybe we want to rethink abortion on demand. Maybe it's evil. Indeed, I'm convinced that it's evil. I'm not sure if Mary Elizabeth Williams would support that, but she did write an article in Salon in January of this year titled, "So What If Abortion Ends Life?" She says she believes life starts at conception. She knows she's killing a baby, but hey, it's never stopped her from having an abortion or from being pro-choice. She says in her article, "I've never wavered for a moment in the belief that I was carrying a human life inside of me. I believe that's what a fetus is, a human life. And that doesn't make me one iota less solidly pro-choice." She says we kill people all the time. If they have a life that we don't value, we kill them. And I think we should be able to do the same thing to babies. Later on in the article, she says, "I can say anecdotally that I'm a mom who loved the lives she incubated from the moment she peed on those sticks, and is also now well over 40 and in an experimental drug trial. If by some random fluke I learned today that I was pregnant, you bet your ass I'd have an abortion. I'd have the world's greatest abortion." She closes her article by saying, "I acknowledge my conviction that the fetus is indeed a life, but it's a life worth sacrificing." And this leads me then to my final point of the show. What's the spirit behind this? Why are we a culture that is willing to kill our babies? I think Mary Elizabeth Williams in Salon gets to it. Her article, and we've mentioned this several times in the show, the spirit behind abortion most of the time is, I don't want to sacrifice something in my life for that baby. Education, money, a relationship, whatever it is. My boyfriend says he'll leave me, so the baby's got to go. Whatever it is, we're willing to sacrifice the baby for whatever it is that we think is more valuable. And the culture tells us that almost everything is more valuable than the life of that baby. Money, sex, power, fame, romance, a new house, not having to shop at Costco, any of these things are more valuable than the life of the baby potentially. So we should sacrifice the life of the baby so that we can live the good life. It actually reminds me of a couple of stories I read in the last year out of India. One happened on October 6th. 10-year-old Aman Kumar went missing from his house in Jamunapur. His mutilated body was discovered several days later in a ditch, and 3 locals were arrested for his murder. They explained that they had lured Aman to their house, tied him with a rope, and gagged him so that he could not shout for help, and then ritually killed the boy as a sacrifice to the gods. A witch doctor had told them that this sacrifice would enable them to find a hidden treasure near their house. Similarly, on December 31st, 2011, 7-year-old Lalita Tati went missing in the state of Chhattisgarh, India. A week later, authorities discovered that she had been murdered in a tribal sacrifice and her liver offered to the gods to improve crop growth. She was, quote, sacrificed by 2 persons superstitiously believing that the act would give a better harvest. Narayan Das, the police chief in Bijapur district, told reporters. Now, I hope you cringe at those stories, but then I hope you cringed at the Gosnell stories. And I hope you cringed when we talked about the abortion procedures that commonly take place thousands of times every day in this country. They're all the same thing. People are killing and mutilating children so that they can gain some benefit. I think the ritual killing described in these stories has the same evil satanic spirit as abortion. It's the same basic lie that the devil has been telling all of humanity since the fall. Give your children to me, and I will give you some sort of material, this worldly benefit in return. Randy Alcorn has a good article about this. He talks about the Gosnell case and summarizes a bit of the news reports as I did, and says the articles about the story are generally correct, but incorrect in one major respect. The abortionist did not kill 7 babies. He killed thousands and thousands of babies. Anyone who only counts them as babies once they get big enough is an accomplice to this man's evil deeds. I must say, Alcorn says, that while I agree that all this is horrific, in fact I am not shocked about it. Why? Because I already knew what was going on in abortion clinics. I already knew that innocent people are killed there by the hundreds every week. 22 years ago I looked in the dumpster of an abortion clinic and saw pieces of human flesh. This is not news to me. I knew that the lives of women are ruined there, and I knew that the, quote, doctors who spend their lives killing babies in most cases know exactly what they are doing. Yes, I've talked to them, he said. The, quote, shocking discovery that an abortionist who made millions of dollars from child killing had such a low regard and such profound disrespect for the lives of babies and women is properly responded to with a, huh? As in, didn't we know that already? And if we didn't, what's wrong with us? He says, I think every congressman and congresswoman who has stood up, wearing their tailored clothes and giving speeches defending late-term abortion, or abortion at any stage, should resign from office. I think every physician who quietly sends women to abortionists should lose his license. In fact, in a morally sane culture, far more serious measures would be taken. They would go to jail because they have assisted in promoting the killing of children. I think that every Christian who keeps voting for pro-choice candidates and who opposes showing the photos of dead babies, while defending what kills the babies in the photos, should question their faith. Is it biblical, or does it merely mirror the current drift of our culture? They should ask whether Jesus would ever defend and vote for the killing of children. I think every church member who is against the observance of Sanctity of Human Life Sunday and thinks the church shouldn't talk about abortion, and every pastor who refuses to speak about it from the pulpit, needs to be taken on a virtual tour of that Pennsylvania clinic and come to terms with what abortion really is. And if the pastor still refuses to open God's Word and talk about defending the rights of the poor and needy and fatherless, and including unborn children in that, then I think he too should resign, along with all members of the church board who lobby against dealing with abortion from the pulpit. If you lack the conviction or the courage to stand up and say to your church, who you are accountable to lead, it's wrong to kill unborn babies, God hates it and will judge it, then you should not be a pastor. If you don't have the guts to say, these are children, we must stop killing them, then you need to do something that doesn't even pretend to take on a biblical and prophetic mantle. Could we please stop pretending? Abortion is in fact the ruthless killing of an innocent human being. That's what it's always been, and that's what it will always be. When Planned Parenthood and now and politicians deny this, they are simply lying. There's nothing new about this. Here's an excerpt from Alcorn's book, Pro-Life Answers to Pro-Choice Arguments. And he speaks of Satan's role in killing children and lying about the fact that they are being killed. Abortion is Satan's attempt to kill God in effigy by destroying the little ones God created in God's image. We are not dealing here with one more social issue, but a unique and focused evil in which Satan has deeply vested interest. Jesus said of the devil, he was a murderer from the beginning. When he lies, he speaks his native language, for he is a liar and father of lies. It is no accident that Jesus speaks about Satan's murders and his lies in the same breath. Lies are the wheels that turn every holocaust. To pull off his murder, Satan tells us lies. He is so eloquent, so persuasive in his lies, and we are so gullible that we fall for his schemes. He masquerades as an angel of light, calling right wrong and wrong right, making us think, as many pro-choicers do, that they are taking the moral high ground, even as they defend something unspeakably immoral. If some of the pro-choice arguments momentarily cloud and eclipse what you know to be right, realize it is simply because the devil is behind the persuasive rhetoric of the pro-choice movement. He is fluent in the language of lies and uses the prevailing assumptions of culture, education, and media to draw us away from God's thoughts about children and abortion and towards his. We are dealing here with forces of darkness that will bitterly resist every effort to combat it and that requires earnest and sustained prayer and alertness to the spiritual battle. The abortion battle is being fought in the realms of thoughts and ideas. Paul says we demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God, and we take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ. As Christian leaders, we must realize that we will be held accountable, both in this life and in eternity, for how we deal with this issue. We must take deliberate and significant measures to stop the killing, to minister to our hurting women, and to make a difference in our community. The desire to be popular and avoid people's disapproval is a common reason for church leaders to hold back in pro-life efforts. But for every reason we have, we must be ready to answer a question on the last day. Was that reason more important than the lives of all those children I created in my image? Alcorn concludes, if you were surprised to discover, as in the case of this Pennsylvania abortion clinic, that those who kill babies for a living are really not very good people, my question is, where have you been? And what have you been thinking goes on in those clinics? And if some abortionists are better at sanitizing the walls and disposing of baby body parts, do you really think that makes them any better in the sight of God Almighty, creator of those children and judge of us all? Good thoughts from Elkhorn. I think we'll leave it at that. We'll see you next time on The Don Johnson Show.